If you were to go back and watch my video on Half-Life Alyx, you may detect a slight undercurrent of disappointment, which may seem strange since Alyx is a really good game. My opinion of Alyx today and when it released is shaped by multiple factors. The game itself, audience reaction to the game, and a deep personal belief in VR as a medium paired with a longing to see VR reach its highest potential. Alyx's art direction is undeniably sublime, and its facial expressions, visuals, physics, and lighting remain, to this day, some of the best you'll see with a headset on. Despite that, I've never really thought that Alyx is a masterpiece, nor that it serves the same purpose for VR that Half-Life 2 served for PC gaming. If anything, Alyx was and is on par with other great VR games. Better in some areas, and standard in others. But since completing Alyx for the first time 2 years ago, I've never been able to shake a sense of uncertainty. An uncertainty toward Alyx's relationship with the future of Half-Life and the future of VR gaming in general. This all resurfaced and hit my brain again when I returned to Half-Life 2 for the VR mod, which released publicly in 2022. Developed by a small group of absolute legends, the Half-Life 2 VR mod is astounding. It has motion controls, finger tracking, recoil effects, and some handy accessibility options like an optional laser pointer for weapons. The SMG has a holographic sight, and the crossbow has a scope with semi-realistic magnification. You can duck behind cover while using a combine machine gun or dual wield and use a gun in your offhand. Practical? No. Fun? Completely. The VR mod scene is fairly active, so much so that it's kind of become the medium's best kept secret. There are more than a few impressive VR ports that showcase the inherent immersive capabilities of VR, where presence and the illusion of scale can give older titles breathtaking new life. In my travels though, Half-Life 2 VR might be the most impressive of such mods. It takes cues from Alyx like ammo and health counters placed on Gordon's hands, and a weapon wheel like hologram for selecting weapons. Reloading is given just enough complexity to stay active, but enough simplicity to stay away from simulation. As of writing, if you completely empty the pistol, you'll have to pull the slide back to chamber a round from a new magazine, and Gordon's SMG and pump-action shotgun work similarly. Ammo is stored at your back, and pointing at objects and closing your hand force pulls them to your hand. Never has it felt better to pick up that can or smash open boxes. The controls are intuitive, largely seamless, and work wonderfully. There are a few rough edges, but the vast majority of the experience is amazing. Hopping in and out of Gordon's hovercraft and buggy, experiencing different speeds of gameplay in quick succession, all works as if it was originally intended to be ported to VR way back in 2004. And while there have been native VR games with similar pacing and speed, I don't think any match the storytelling and legacy of Half-Life 2. Half-Life 2 plays so well in VR that Alyx, by comparison, feels more than just a different genre. It feels simplified and even a tad antiquated. I should disclose here that I'm going to repeat some things I said in my first video about Alyx, specifically about Alyx's accessible design, as well as other things I've said about VR in general, but it all bears repeating. Accessibility in VR is a delicate discussion, and one in which I don't want to come off as insensitive. Accessibility is not only necessary, but makes the industry better, and figuring out how to make a VR game accessible is not a challenge I envy of developers. But not all games are going to lend themselves to accessible design, and serious limitations can be imposed on a game depending on how its accessibility is implemented. If you are susceptible to motion sickness, you probably can't play VTOL, a combat flight simulator made for VR. The game's nature as a flight sim means solutions like teleportation and snap turning would be impossible, if not extremely difficult to implement, and that's going to bar certain people from being able to play. But I don't think this means VTOL as it exists now shouldn't exist. To be clear, none of this means the industry shouldn't experiment with and find solutions to make games like VTOL accessible. For us, Alyx's implementation of accessibility is a good case study. Shootouts with Combine soldiers are short, repetitive, largely unimaginative, and many take place in small, enclosed, speedball field-like arenas. The play area here is seemingly designed so that it works whether you're moving via teleportation or with thumbsticks. As a result, Alyx's combat feels rudimentary, and a repetitiveness sets in that Half-Life 2, almost 20 years earlier, avoided by being a much more varied and dynamic shooter. In Alyx, antlions represent gameplay far removed from the chaotic active combat they induced in Half-Life 2. They're slower, shooting gallery enemies, though maybe a little scarier. In the VR mod, that chaotic bug bashing transitions into VR seamlessly. It's just as active, fast, and enjoyable with the headset on as it was and is with a mouse and keyboard. Again, though, maybe a little scarier. In totality, Alyx, while obviously no less intuitive and smooth, is also much more restrictive and diverges away from Half-Life shooter roots and toward a slower survival horror pace. It does so seemingly not out of artistic choice, but necessity. From a logistical standpoint, I think you could make an argument that Alyx's accessible design makes sense. Being the first Half-Life game in more than a decade and launching a little less than a year after the Valve Index, it makes sense that Valve would want an app that could be played by a large audience, VR legs or not. Thanks to Valve's platform-agnostic approach, I imagine Alyx was and will continue to be one of the first games people boot up when they put on a headset for the first time. But after playing Half-Life 2 in VR and then returning to Alyx, the steps taken in Alyx for comfort and accessibility feel like an overcompensation. While playing Alyx, I constantly want to sprint between cover and wish the firefights were faster and more frenetic. You can teleport in Alyx, which also acts as a pseudo-sprint, but the sensation is not the same as sprinting through gunfire or past enemies. Half-Life 2's combat in VR works beautifully. It plays out exactly as you'd imagine it in your head, even with the faster pace and changing environments. As an aside, I think it would be good to acknowledge here that adding accessibility options to a game doesn't necessarily mean the game will work well with those settings. I'm not a game developer, and I'm positive there are more unknown unknowns than I can possibly imagine, but fixes like adding a sprint option I don't think would solve Alyx's issues because the game, as a whole, is designed around that limited, controlled scope. The difference between Alyx's combat and Half-Life 2's combat is not just the pace, it's also the number of enemies, the environments, the weapons, and more. The team behind Half-Life 2 VR even says that adding teleportation to Half-Life 2 would be difficult because the game wasn't made with teleportation in mind. As we've discussed, I think there are experiences that just won't easily lend themselves to certain types of accessibility. Half-Life 2 VR sports gameplay and scenarios more visually complex and faster paced than VR games made today, and it's completely playable. In 20 years, when we look back on Alyx, I don't think it'll be viewed with the same reverence as Half-Life 2, even considering the context of its release. Will we look back on it as a necessary step in VR onboarding? Maybe, but therein lies the uncertainty I'm so uncomfortable with. The VR market is in an awkward place at the moment, with the company that has the largest market share focusing on trash-fired metaverse social media bullshit, all of which represents the future of algorithm-driven focused advertising and none of which represents the future of VR. Meanwhile, Valve is chillin' up in Seattle, rolling in piles of capital, much of which is from market consolidation and loot boxes, but also with the ability to create wholly unique VR experiences, the kinds of experiences that take full advantage of the medium's capabilities. If Half-Life 2 works in VR right now, what would a real, full-fledged modernization look like? Not a remake, but the concepts and gameplay that made it good ported into a title built from the ground up for VR. If Alyx were more complex, faster paced, and included more varied gameplay, would that have gated enough players off to hurt its playability and market? I know that's a big hypothetical question, but I suspect the answer is no.